Listen to me, you arrogant bitch. Richard Blackwell's voice cut through the first-class cabin like a blade. The words didn't slip out by accident. They were delivered with the full force of a man who believed his bank account made him untouchable. I don't know who you slept with or what diversity quota you filled to get a ticket on this plane, but you do not speak to me like that. I could buy and sell you before breakfast. Before anyone could react, he grabbed his heavy crystal tumbler. In one swift, furious motion, he flung the contents directly at the woman in seat 2A. Cold ice and amber liquid struck her square in the chest. Bourbon splashed up into her face, stinging her eyes and soaking the front of her white cashmere sweater. The ice cubes clattered loudly onto her laptop keyboard and bounced onto the polished floor. The entire first-class cabin gasped in collective horror. What Richard didn't know was that the woman calmly wiping bourbon from her eyes wasn't just another passenger. She was Jasmine Carter, incoming Vice President of Operations for Skybridge Airlines, the parent company of the very airline he was flying. And in exactly 45 minutes, when the landing gear touched down in London, his entire world would violently unravel. Before we dive into how this ended, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe respect belongs in every cabin, regardless of ticket price, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Because what happens next will restore your faith in accountability and prove that karma doesn't forget a single name. Now let's rewind to how this disaster began 7 hours earlier at JFK International Airport. Terminal 4 hummed with the frenetic energy of thousands of travelers rushing to catch flights to every corner of the globe. But inside the exclusive flagship first-class lounge, the atmosphere was a muted sanctuary of clinking espresso cups and hushed high-stakes conversations. Jasmine Carter sat in a plush corner chair near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac. Her attention was fixed entirely on the glowing screen of her tablet. At 34 years old, she was dressed in a simple, unstructured cashmere sweater, the color of fresh cream, and dark tailored trousers that deliberately projected an aura of quiet anonymity. Her natural hair was pulled back into a low bun, no designer logos, no flashy jewelry, just calm, intelligent eyes that had seen this particular pattern play out dozens of times before. Nobody looking at her would guess that she was the incoming Vice President of Operations for Skybridge Airlines, the massive aviation conglomerate that had just aggressively acquired the very carrier she was about to fly. Her peaceful review of the quarterly restructuring files was suddenly shattered by a voice that boomed across the serene lounge like a foghorn cutting through morning mist. I don't care if the restructuring takes 6 months, David. Gut the department. Fire them all if you have to. Just make the margins look pretty for the shareholders by third quarter. Jasmine briefly raised her eyes from the tablet. Standing near the complimentary champagne bar was a man in his late 40s. His face flushed with self-importance and what appeared to be his third glass of champagne before noon. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that screamed new money and a Patek Philippe watch that he kept prominently displayed as he gesticulated wildly with his free hand. This was Richard Blackwell, 46 years old, a man who had built his entire identity around intimidation, leveraged buyouts, and treating service workers like furniture that occasionally made inconvenient noises. Richard ended his call by aggressively jabbing his thumb into the screen of his phone, letting out an exasperated sigh and snapping his fingers at a passing lounge attendant. Double espresso and make sure it's actually hot this time, he barked, not even bothering to look the young man in the eye. The attendant nodded quickly, his professional smile tight and strained. Jasmine observed him for a fleeting second before returning to her work. Over her 15 years in the corporate aviation and finance sectors, she had encountered hundreds of men exactly like Richard Blackwell. They were predictable in their arrogance, loud in their insecurities, and completely oblivious to the shifting power dynamics in the rooms they occupied. She made a mental note of his behavior, a habit honed from years of assessing corporate culture and identifying toxic patterns, before they metastasized and went back to analyzing the crew deployment metrics on her screen. 45 minutes later, the boarding call for Flight 419 to London Heathrow echoed through the terminal speakers. Jasmine preferred to board early to settle in without the chaos of the boarding rush. She gathered her leather tote, closed her tablet with a quiet snap, and walked down the jet bridge with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had spent half her life in the sky and felt more at home at 35,000 feet than she did on the ground. Jasmine found her assigned seat, 2A, a spacious window pod in the first-class cabin with its own privacy divider and fully reclining bed. The leather was butter-soft, the color of rich caramel. She stowed her small carry-on bag carefully in the overhead compartment directly above her seat, making sure it was secure and wouldn't shift during the flight. As she finished adjusting the bag, a heavy hand abruptly shoved past her shoulder with shocking force, nearly knocking her off balance. She grabbed the seat back to steady herself. "Excuse me, I need this bin space." The sharp voice came from directly behind her. Jasmine turned to see Richard Blackwell glaring down at her with undisguised irritation. He was holding a bulky, oversized leather garment bag that clearly exceeded the standard carry-on dimensions by at least 6 inches in every direction. "There is plenty of space in the bin across the aisle," Jasmine replied evenly, her voice calm and perfectly modulated. She maintained her ground, finishing the secure placement of her tote with deliberate care. Richard let out a harsh theatrical scoff that carried to the rows behind them. "I prefer my bag directly above my seat. Seat 2B, which is right here. So if you wouldn't mind moving your little purse somewhere else, I have actual business equipment to store." He said the words "little purse" with such dripping condescension that the flight attendant preparing the galley 2 rows up stopped what she was doing and looked over with concern. "My bag is already secured and it belongs in the bin designated for row 2, Jasmine said, offering a polite but completely uncompromising smile. "I'm sure the flight attendant can assist you if you're having trouble finding space for your oversized luggage." Richard's eyes narrowed into slits. He looked Jasmine up and down slowly, his gaze lingering with a distinct calculating dismissiveness that made her skin crawl. He saw a black woman in unbranded casual clothing traveling alone with no visible entourage or status symbols. In his narrow, prejudiced worldview, shaped by 46 years of unchecked privilege, she didn't belong in a $5,000 transatlantic seat. He assumed she was an off-duty employee flying standby on a non-revenue ticket, or someone who had burned years of accumulated frequent flyer miles for a one-time upgrade to see how the elite traveled. The possibility that she had paid full fare, or more importantly, that she might outrank him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine, never even crossed his mind. "Listen." Richard leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a patronizing register that made the words sound like he was explaining basic arithmetic to a child. "Some of us actually paid full fare to be up here, and we have critical client meetings the moment we land in London. Move the bag, or I'll have the crew move it for you." Before Jasmine could respond, a senior flight attendant hurried over from the galley, her professional smile firmly in place, but her eyes betraying exhaustion. Her name tag read, Gabriela Reyes. She was a Latina woman in her late 30s with warm brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a flawless bun. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Blackwell?" Gabriela asked, her tone carefully neutral. It was immediately clear from her use of his name that she had dealt with him on previous flights and knew exactly what kind of passenger he was. "Yes, Gabriela. This passenger is taking up my overhead space." Richard lied smoothly, pointing at Jasmine's compact bag with the certainty of someone who had never been questioned when he bent the truth. "I need it moved to the back so my suit doesn't get crushed. I have meetings in London that cannot be rescheduled." Gabriela turned to Jasmine with an apologetic expression that spoke volumes about the impossible position flight attendants were constantly put in. "Ma'am, would you mind terribly if we relocated your bag to row 4 to accommodate Mr. Blackwell's garment bag? It would really help us maintain our departure schedule." Jasmine looked at Gabriela and instantly recognized the exhausted plea in the flight attendant's eyes. This was a woman who had been trained to de-escalate volatile passengers at all costs to ensure an on-time departure. Gabriella was just trying to do her job in an industry that too often sacrificed employee dignity on the altar of customer satisfaction metrics. Jasmine, keeping her undercover status intact for the time being, decided not to force the issue and make this employee's life harder than it already was. "That's perfectly fine," Jasmine said, softly nodding to Gabriella with understanding. "Thank you for asking." Gabriella's shoulders sagged slightly with relief. She carefully retrieved Jasmine's tote from the overhead bin and carried it 4 rows back, stowing it securely above the empty row 4 seats. "Unbelievable," Richard muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Jasmine to hear, as he forcefully shoved his oversized bag into the newly cleared space. The bag barely fit even with the entire bin to itself. "Shouldn't even be in this cabin." The words hung in the air like smoke. Gabriella, returning from stowing Jasmine's bag, heard them clearly but kept her face carefully neutral. She had heard variations of that comment hundreds of times in her 12 years of flying, and every single time it felt like a small cut that never quite healed. Jasmine settled into her window seat with practiced grace, her expression unreadable. She pulled out her tablet from the seat back pocket where she'd temporarily stored it and opened a blank document. She typed a single name in the Notes app, Richard Blackwell. The flight hadn't even pushed back from the gate yet, but the atmosphere in row 2 was already thick with unspoken hostility that pressed against the cabin walls like building pressure before a storm. The heavy Rolls-Royce engines roared to life 15 minutes later, pushing the massive Boeing 777 down the runway with controlled power before it gracefully lifted into the night sky over New York. The city lights spread out below them like a glittering circuit board, and then they were swallowed by clouds and darkness as the aircraft climbed toward its cruising altitude. As the plane climbed to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, the cabin lights dimmed into a soothing, ambient blue that was meant to help passengers relax and adjust to the long overnight flight. For Jasmine, the first hour of Flight 419 became a masterclass in aggressive entitlement from the man sitting beside her. The first-class pods were specifically designed to offer maximum privacy, with high dividers and personal space, but Richard seemed determined to breach those boundaries at every opportunity. He immediately claimed the shared center console between seats 2A and 2B, spreading his elbows wide and aggressively staking his territorial claim like a dog marking its territory. He took off his expensive Italian leather shoes without bothering to use the provided slippers, tossing them carelessly toward the aisle where they landed with dull thuds. Then he began snapping his fingers every single time Gabriella walked past his seat, the sharp sound cutting through the quiet hum of the engines. "Gabriella, another Macallan neat," he called out loudly, his voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere. "And where are the warm nuts I thought this airline prided itself on premium service?" Right away, Mr. Blackwell Gabriella replied tightly, her professional facade cracking just slightly around the edges. Her jaw was clenched so hard that a small muscle jumped near her ear. Jasmine continued her work analyzing a highly confidential merger document on her tablet that outlined the complete restructuring of the carrier they were currently flying. She kept her screen brightness turned down low and angled carefully away from Richard, though she could feel his eyes occasionally darting toward her space with poorly concealed curiosity and contempt. The alcohol was hitting his bloodstream fast, eroding whatever thin veneer of social grace he might have possessed when sober. His movements became looser, his voice louder, and his sense of personal boundaries non-existent. By the time the elaborate multi-course dinner service began rolling down the aisle on gleaming carts, Richard was on his 4th scotch in less than an hour. He turned to Jasmine with an ugly, condescending smirk plastered across his flushed face. "So," Richard drawled, slowly swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass like he was performing for an audience, "who do you work for that they let you burn company points for a seat up here? Or did you just save up for a really long time to see how the other half lives?" Jasmine slowly turned her head away from her work, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that should have warned him to stop talking. The sheer audacity of his microaggression was staggering, yet sadly familiar to anyone who had ever been underestimated because of the color of their skin. "I work for myself," Jasmine replied simply, her tone giving away nothing. "And I don't use points for my travel." Richard let out a barking laugh that was far too loud for the quiet cabin, drawing annoyed looks from the passengers in row 1. A woman traveling with her teenage daughter actually turned around in her seat to stare at him with open disapproval. "Right, sure you don't," he said with exaggerated skepticism, taking another long sip of his drink. "I'm a managing director at Pinnacle Capital. I manage investment portfolios larger than the GDP of small countries. I fly this route twice a month for business. I know exactly who sits in these seats, and it's usually not people in sweatshirts typing on little iPads. It's cashmere, actually," Jasmine noted mildly, completely unbothered by his attempts to belittle her. "And I find that true wealth and power rarely need to announce themselves quite so loudly. Mr. Blackwell." The comment hit its mark with surgical precision. Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red that started at his collar and crept up to his hairline. His ego, already fragile beneath all the expensive tailoring and the pharmaceutical-grade alcohol, had been bruised by a woman he had already decided was beneath him in every meaningful way. "You've got a lot of mouth for someone who's clearly out of her depth," he sneered, leaning closer to the privacy divider that separated their pods. "You know what your problem is. People like you are ruining the exclusivity of travel. They give away upgrades to fill seats, and suddenly, people who actually matter have to deal with the riffraff." The phrase "people like you" hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that everyone within earshot understood perfectly. Jasmine didn't flinch. She deliberately reached up with one hand and pressed the call button above her seat, the soft chime echoing through the cabin. When Gabriella appeared a moment later, slightly out of breath from dealing with another demanding passenger in row 5, Jasmine spoke in a clear, authoritative tone that carried natural command. "Gabriella, could you please bring me a glass of sparkling water with lime, and perhaps you could check on Mr. Blackwell. He seems a bit agitated this evening. I believe he might need some coffee to balance out his enthusiasm." Gabriella had to bite the inside of her cheek hard to hide a smile that threatened to break through her professional mask. "Right away, ma'am. Mr. Blackwell, can I get you some water or perhaps some coffee?" "I don't need coffee," Richard snapped, slamming his glass down on the tray table so hard that the remaining scotch splashed over the rim and pooled on the polished surface. "I want another drink, and I want her to mind her own damn business." "Sir, I think we're going to hold off on the alcohol service for a little while," Gabriella said smoothly, falling back on the exact phrasing her training manual recommended for cutting off intoxicated passengers. "We'll be serving the main dinner course shortly." Richard glared at the flight attendant with pure venom, then shifted his furious gaze back to Jasmine. He was utterly convinced that she was the reason he was being cut off from the bar. In his alcohol-soaked mind, he was the victim of an insubordinate crew member and an arrogant interloper who didn't know her place. Jasmine took a calm sip of the sparkling water that Gabriella delivered moments later, the glass cold and refreshing against her lips. Feeling the tension in the air radiating from the seat next to her like heat waves coming off scorching pavement, she opened a new, highly encrypted application on her tablet. It was the Master Passenger Manifest and crew database accessible only to top-tier executives of the airline with the highest security clearance. She pulled up Richard Blackwell's profile with a few quick taps. The system populated his information immediately. He was indeed a managing director at Pinnacle Capital, just as he'd boasted. He was also a top-tier elite member of their frequent flyer program with over 2 million miles flown in the past 5 years. But what caught Jasmine's eye and made her pause was the corporate account number attached to his profile. Pinnacle Capital was currently in the final stages of negotiating an exclusive corporate travel contract with Skybridge Airlines, worth an estimated £40 million over 3 years. A contract that Jasmine, as the incoming vice president of operations, had the ultimate authority to approve or terminate with a single signature. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile played at the corners of Jasmine's mouth. She tapped a few keys on the screen, flagging the Pinnacle Capital contract file for immediate review the moment she landed in London. Mr. Blackwell was digging his own grave at 35,000 feet, with every word that came out of his mouth, and he had absolutely no idea who was holding the shovel. The cabin lights were brought up slightly as the extravagant multi-course dinner service concluded with chocolate truffles and aged port. Most passengers were settling in to watch movies on their personal entertainment screens, or reclining their pods into fully flat beds for the final stretch across the Atlantic Ocean. Jasmine was deep into drafting a stern internal memo regarding passenger conduct protocols, every word inspired entirely by the man sitting next to her. Richard had managed to bully another flight attendant, a young man named Marcus, who was clearly new and intimidated into bringing him one last double scotch by threatening to file a formal complaint with corporate headquarters. He was currently struggling to slice through a medium-rare filet mignon, his movements sloppy and uncoordinated, as the alcohol continued to impair his motor skills. Without warning, his knife slipped off the edge of the ceramic plate with a screech. The heavy piece of silverware flipped through the air in a lazy arc and landed squarely on Jasmine's armrest, leaving a thick streak of dark brown gravy across the pristine white cashmere of her sleeve. Jasmine looked down at the stain spreading slowly across the expensive fabric, then looked up at Richard with an expression of controlled displeasure. "Oh, for God's sake," Richard muttered, not sounding the least bit apologetic or concerned. "Just wipe it off. It's not a big deal. You dropped your knife on my arm, ruined an expensive garment, and your first instinct is to tell me it's not a big deal?" Jasmine asked, her voice dropping an octave and carrying a dangerous, razor-sharp edge that made the passenger across the aisle look over with concern. "Don't give me that attitude," Richard fired back, pointing a greasy finger at her face. "It was an accident." The turbulence bumped my arm. "There hasn't been a single pocket of turbulence in the last 2 hours, Mr. Blackwell. You are simply intoxicated and acting like a child." The word child snapped the last remaining thread of Richard's self-control like a rubber band stretched too far. But before the explosion came, something shifted in Jasmine's mind. Richard's phrase, "people like you," echoed in her head, triggering a memory she had spent years trying to bury in the back of her consciousness. She was 27 years old again, sitting in a different first-class cabin on a different flight 5 years ago. The memory unfolded with perfect clarity, every detail sharp and painful. It was a critical flight to Frankfurt, Germany. Jasmine had co-founded a small aviation technology startup with 2 partners from MIT, and they were flying to meet with a venture capital firm that was considering an $8 million Series A investment. The meeting could make or break their company. Jasmine had purchased her first-class ticket with her own money she'd saved from 2 years of brutal consulting work because she knew she needed to arrive fresh and focused for the most important pitch of her life. She'd dressed professionally in a navy blazer and tailored pants. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She carried a leather portfolio and a laptop bag. She looked every bit the young executive she was. But the Caucasian businessman in the seat next to hers, wearing a designer suit and expensive cologne, had taken one look at her and called the flight attendant over before the plane even pushed back from the gate. "I think there's been a seating error," he'd said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear, looking at Jasmine with barely concealed disgust. "She doesn't look like she belongs here." The flight attendant, a blonde woman in her 50s, had immediately turned to Jasmine. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" Jasmine had provided it, her hand steady even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "And your passport and credit card used for booking." The man had sat there the entire time, sipping his pre-departure champagne with a smug expression on his face, watching her produce documentation like a defendant proving her innocence in a court where she was guilty until proven otherwise. Other passengers had turned to stare. Some whispered. A few looked away uncomfortably, aware that something unjust was happening but unwilling to speak up. The flight attendant had finally said, "Everything seems to be in order. My apologies," and walked away without a word to the man who had initiated the entire humiliating ordeal. No apology to Jasmine for the public degradation. No acknowledgement that what had just happened was wrong. The man had turned to his window dismissive, like Jasmine had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience quickly resolved. Jasmine had made that Frankfurt meeting. She'd delivered the pitch through exhaustion and suppressed rage. They'd closed the $8 million investment round. She'd used that funding to pivot the company into aviation operations consulting, where she discovered she had a gift for identifying inefficiencies and broken cultures within airlines. She'd risen through the ranks with single-minded focus, propelled by that humiliation and dozens of others like it. She'd made herself a promise that night over Frankfurt, somewhere between rage and determination. One day she would own the entire system that had tried to erase her. One day she would have the power to make sure no one else had to produce 3 forms of ID just to prove they belonged in a seat they'd paid for. Now sitting in seat 2A on Flight 419 with bourbon-stained cashmere and a knife covered in gravy, Jasmine realized with perfect clarity that the day she'd promised herself had finally arrived. She closed her eyes for just a moment, centering herself. Then she opened them and looked at Richard Blackwell with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what came next. She pulled up her notes app and typed 3 additional entries below his name: crew protection protocols. Immediate review needed. Elite status does not supersede safety or dignity. Pinnacle Capital contract. Hold pending full review of corporate culture. "Listen to me, you arrogant bitch!" Richard hissed, his deep-seated prejudices finally exploding through the crumbling dam of alcohol and wounded pride. He leaned entirely out of his pod, looming over Jasmine's space with his face twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. "I don't know who you slept with or what diversity quota you filled to get a ticket on this plane, but you do not speak to me like that. I could buy and sell you before breakfast." The surrounding passengers gasped audibly. Heads whipped around from rows 3 and 4. A man traveling alone in seat 3. A Oliver Hutchinson, a 52-year-old British tech investor with salt and pepper hair, lowered his Financial Times newspaper slowly, his eyes widening with shock at what he was witnessing. Jasmine did not shrink back or flinch. She met Richard's furious, bloodshot eyes with a stare so intensely cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the entire cabin by 10 degrees. "I strongly suggest," Jasmine said, articulating every single syllable with lethal precision, "that you sit back down, turn around, and do not speak another word to me for the duration of this flight. If you do not, I promise you the consequences will be severe." Richard's face contorted into an ugly, mocking sneer that revealed teeth stained slightly purple from the wine he'd had with dinner. "Consequences from you. What are you going to do? Write a little blog post about me before anyone could move or speak or process what was happening?" Richard grabbed his heavy crystal tumbler from the tray table. In one swift, furious motion, fueled by rage and entitlement and prejudice distilled into pure action, he flung the entire contents directly at Jasmine. Cold ice and amber liquid struck her square in the chest with shocking force. The bourbon splashed up into her face, burning her eyes and flooding her nostrils with the sharp smell of alcohol. It soaked through the white cashmere sweater, instantly the fabric turning translucent and clinging to her skin. Ice cubes clattered loudly onto her laptop keyboard, bounced onto the tray table, and scattered across the floor of the cabin. A collective gasp echoed through the first-class cabin, like a wave breaking against rocks. "Hey, what the hell is wrong with you, Oliver Hutchinson?" shouted his British accent sharp with outrage. He unbuckled his seatbelt immediately and stood up, his tall frame imposing. "That's assault." Gabriella practically sprinted down the aisle from the galley, her eyes wide with horror. She was followed closely by Michael Torres, the purser, a tall, stern-looking Hispanic man in his early 40s who commanded immediate respect. Richard immediately tried to backpedal, his alcohol-fogged brain finally registering that he might have crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "She was threatening me," he said loudly, looking around at the other passengers with desperate eyes. "You all heard her threaten me, right?" She said. "There would be consequences. I was just defending my space." Michael stepped between Richard and Jasmine, using his body as a physical shield, while Gabriella knelt beside Jasmine's seat. "Mr. Blackwell, you are to remain in your seat," Michael said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Do not move. Do not speak." Gabriella's hands were shaking slightly as she offered a stack of warm cotton towels to Jasmine, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "Ma'am? Oh my God. I'm so sorry. Are you hurt? Did it get in your eyes?" Jasmine took a long, slow breath that seemed to last forever. She wiped the burning alcohol from her eyelids with careful, deliberate movements. Then she methodically blotted the ruined cashmere, the towel coming away dark with bourbon and gravy. She looked down at her laptop. Miraculously, the screen was still on, though the keyboard was dripping with scotch and melting ice. The entire cabin was waiting for her to explode. They expected screaming, crying, maybe even a physical altercation. They expected a scene worthy of the viral videos they'd all watched on social media. Instead, Jasmine Carter was terrifyingly, impossibly silent. She calmly handed the soiled towels back to Gabriella. "I am uninjured, Gabriella. Thank you for your concern." Then Jasmine turned her gaze back to Richard. He was staring at her now, and for the first time since boarding, a flicker of genuine unease broke through his drunken bravado. He had expected her to break down, to give him the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. Her absolute stillness unsettled him in a way he couldn't articulate or understand. Without breaking eye contact with Richard for even a second, Jasmine reached for her slightly damp tablet. Her movements were precise and unhurried, like a surgeon selecting instruments before a delicate operation. She didn't call for the air marshal. She didn't demand the captain turn the plane around. She didn't threaten to sue or scream about her rights. Instead, she connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi network with a few taps, her fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. She opened a direct encrypted messaging channel that bypassed all standard airline communications protocols, going straight to the ground control operations headquarters of Skybridge Airlines in London. The system required biometric authentication. She placed her thumb on the tablet's scanner. The screen flashed green, identity confirmed. Executive-level access. She typed 3 swift messages, each one a precisely aimed bullet. Message 1, Flight 419. Passenger, Richard Blackwell, Seat 2, B. Physical assault on my person, documented by multiple witnesses. Have Metropolitan Police Aviation Security Unit waiting at arrival gate. Priority response required. Message 2. Cancel Pinnacle Capital corporate travel contract effective immediately. No negotiations, no exceptions. £40 million contract terminated due to representative conduct unbecoming of business partnership. Message 3. Contact David Patterson, founding partner at Pinnacle Capital. Inform him his managing director is being arrested upon landing for assault. Recommend immediate termination for breach of corporate morality clause and reputational damage to both firms. She hit send on all 3 messages simultaneously. The responses came back within 90 seconds. Even at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, ground control response. Metropolitan Police Aviation Security notified. 4 officers will board upon gate arrival. Captain Reynolds has been briefed. Aircraft will hold all passengers until suspect is removed. Legal Department response, Pinnacle Capital contract cancellation processed. David Patterson, contacted personally by our general counsel. He is cooperating fully and has expressed his profound apologies for the incident. Executive response. We are horrified by this incident. Full support for any action you deem appropriate. The entire leadership team stands behind you. Jasmine closed the tablet and carefully wiped a stray drop of bourbon from her cheek with the back of her hand. She looked at Richard, who was now being sternly lectured by Michael the purser and a plainclothes air marshal who had quietly materialized from business class like a ghost stepping through walls. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," Richard slurred, trying desperately to project confidence but failing miserably. His voice cracked slightly. "I'll pay for the dry cleaning. Christ, it was just a drink." Jasmine finally offered him a smile. It was a terrifying, hollow expression, completely devoid of any warmth or humanity, the smile of someone who had just made a series of calculations and was satisfied with the results. "Keep your money," Mr. Blackwell, Jasmine said softly, her voice carrying easily over the low drone of the engines. "You're going to need every single penny of it by tomorrow morning." Oliver Hutchinson, still standing in the aisle, had pulled out his smartphone. He'd been recording since the moment Richard threw the drink, capturing everything in crystal-clear high-definition video. Now he was speaking quietly into the camera. "We're on Flight 419 to London. A passenger just threw alcohol at a woman in first class. This was deliberate assault at 35,000 feet. This is being recorded and will be posted the moment we land. Everyone needs to see this." A woman sitting in seat 3B leaned forward, her voice clear and firm. "I saw everything. He's been harassing her since takeoff. This was completely unprovoked assault." Another passenger from row 4 called out his American accent sharp. The crew cut him off from alcohol and he got violent. "I heard him threaten her before he threw the drink." Richard's face was now pale beneath the flush of alcohol, a sickly gray-green color that suggested his body was finally beginning to process the magnitude of his mistake. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a sharp ding that cut through the tense atmosphere. Overhead, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom system with perfect professional calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We have begun our initial descent into London Heathrow. Current weather at Heathrow is cloudy with light rain temperature 7 degrees Celsius. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival." As the massive aircraft banked slightly to the left, piercing through the thick cloud cover over the English countryside, Richard Blackwell leaned back in his seat and rubbed his temples with shaking hands. The alcohol was turning into a sour, pounding headache that seemed to be tightening around his skull like a vice. He convinced himself desperately, pathetically, that the woman was just bluffing, another corporate nobody making empty threats to feel powerful. He didn't know that on the ground in London, sirens were already wailing across the tarmac as police vehicles raced into position. He didn't know that his multi-million-pound career was currently being dismantled brick by careful brick by the very woman he had just assaulted. The plane was going down, and so was Richard Blackwell. The Boeing 777 sliced through the thick gray cloud cover that perpetually blanketed London like a heavy wool blanket. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the speed brakes deployed with a mechanical groan bleeding off velocity as they descended toward Heathrow Airport. Inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The ambient lighting had transitioned from the soothing blue of cruising altitude to a crisp, waking white that cast harsh shadows across every surface and made Richard's flushed face look even more unhealthy. The adrenaline rush from his violent outburst had completely evaporated, replaced by a pounding sour headache that throbbed behind his eyes like a second heartbeat. His mouth tasted of stale scotch and something bitter that might have been regret, though he would never admit that to himself or anyone else. He shifted uncomfortably in his plush leather seat, his expensive trousers now wrinkled and damp with sweat, trying desperately to ignore the sticky residue of spilled alcohol on his hands. He glanced sideways toward seat 2A with what he hoped was casual indifference. Jasmine Carter was a statue of perfect, terrifying composure. She hadn't spoken a single word since delivering her chilling promise about needing every penny. She sat with her posture flawlessly straight, a damp towel still draped carefully over her lap to protect her trousers from the bourbon that continued to seep slowly from her ruined cashmere sweater. She was looking out the window, watching the sprawling geometric grids of London suburbs materialize through the mist below her expression unreadable as carved marble. Richard tried to force a scoff, muttering under his breath to reassure himself against the growing dread in his stomach. "She's a nobody," he thought aggressively, rubbing his temples to try to relieve the pressure. "Probably some mid-level HR manager on a corporate retreat. She's trying to play hardball to feel important for once in her meaningless life. I deal with actual sharks every day in finance. I'm not going to be intimidated by a woman who doesn't even have the decency to dress properly for a first-class cabin." But even as he tried to convince himself, doubt crept in around the edges like water seeping under a door. He needed to focus on what mattered. Today was not just any business trip. At 2 o'clock this afternoon, Richard was scheduled to walk into the boardroom of Sterling and Whitmore Capital Pinnacle's biggest rival in the London financial district and finalize a £400 million hostile takeover that had been 18 months in the making. It was the crowning achievement of his career, the deal that would secure him a 7-figure bonus and a guaranteed partnership at Pinnacle Capital by the end of the fiscal year. David Patterson, the firm's ruthless founding partner, was flying in from Dubai just to sign the paperwork alongside Richard and share in the glory of the kill. Richard couldn't afford a distraction, let alone a formal airline complaint that might delay him or cause embarrassing questions. He needed to get off this plane, get to his hotel, shower and change, and get to that meeting. "Excuse me," Richard called out, roughly snapping his fingers in the direction of the galley with the automatic entitlement of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. Gabriella stepped out from behind the galley curtain. Her previously accommodating demeanor had completely vanished, replaced by a mask of absolute icy professionalism that could have frozen fire. Her dark eyes were hard as stones. "Yes, sir," she asked, her tone utterly devoid of the mandatory customer service warmth she'd been trained to project. She did not step any closer to his seat than was strictly necessary for communication, maintaining a careful distance as though he might lash out physically at any moment. "Bring me a hot towel and a black coffee," Richard ordered, massaging his jaw where tension had settled like concrete. "I need to wake up and get someone to wipe down this console. It's sticky from the spill." "I apologize, sir, but the cabin is secured for landing," Gabriella replied crisply, her words clipped and precise. "We are no longer permitted to serve hot beverages or move freely through the aisles. FAA regulations." "I'm a million-miler with this airline." "Gabriella," Richard sneered, his voice rising and taking on that familiar grating edge of entitlement that had gotten him everything he wanted for 4 decades. "I think you can manage a simple cup of coffee." Before Gabriella could respond or call for backup, Michael Torres emerged from the galley. His face was unusually pale, and he was clutching a thermal paper printout from the aircraft's ACARS system, the sophisticated communication system that allowed direct encrypted messaging between the cockpit and ground control operations. Michael's eyes darted past Richard as though he didn't exist, and fixed squarely on Jasmine with an expression of profound, unadulterated shock that was quickly masked by deep reverence. Michael stepped forward decisively, placing himself firmly between Richard and Gabriella like a physical barrier. "Sir, as my colleague stated, service has concluded for the flight," Michael said, his voice carrying absolute finality. "I must insist you keep your voice down and remain secured in your seat for landing." Richard opened his mouth to argue, to pull rank, to threaten to have them both fired. Michael had already turned his back on him, the ultimate sign of disrespect in the carefully calibrated hierarchy of first-class service where passengers were supposed to be treated like royalty. The purser leaned down, bringing himself to eye level with Jasmine. His voice dropped to a respectful whisper that Richard strained unsuccessfully to hear over the increasing roar of the engines. "Ma'am," Michael said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "The captain just received an encrypted alpha-level override from ground operations. We had no idea who you were when you boarded this aircraft. The crew and I are profoundly sorry for what transpired during this flight." His hands were shaking slightly as he held the printout. "Ground control has confirmed all your requests have been executed. Is there absolutely anything else you require before wheels down?" Jasmine finally turned away from the window. She offered Michael a small but genuine smile, warm and human, and so different from the cold expression she'd given Richard that it was like watching ice transform into sunlight. "You handled a volatile situation to the absolute best of your training," Michael, Jasmine said quietly, her voice a soothing balm compared to Richard's barking demands. "Gabriella did as well. You both protected the safety of this cabin under difficult circumstances. There will be a comprehensive review of our boarding protocols regarding intoxicated passengers, but neither of you will face any penalties. I'll make sure of that personally. Just ensure the aisle is clear when the authorities board." "Understood." "Ma'am?" Michael breathed relief, flooding his features. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Richard caught fragments of the exchange. He heard the word authorities and felt his stomach drop. He scrambled through his memory, his alcohol-fogged brain trying desperately to connect dots that seemed to shift and blur every time he got close. The landing gear deployed with a heavy mechanical clunk that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the overhead bins. The sprawling tarmac of Heathrow Airport rushed up to meet them through breaks in the clouds. With a screech of rubber on wet pavement and the thunderous roar of reverse thrust, Flight 419 slammed onto the runway and began aggressively decelerating. Richard grabbed the armrests with white-knuckled intensity, his whole body rigid. The physical jolt of the landing did absolutely nothing to settle his churning stomach. As the plane turned off the active runway and began its slow taxi toward Terminal 3, Richard looked out his window again, seeking the familiar sight of the gate. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. 3 heavy-duty neon yellow vehicles with flashing blue lights were speeding across the tarmac, cutting directly across the designated taxiways and safety zones. They were moving fast, mirroring the aircraft's path with obvious purpose. "Probably an emergency on another runway," Richard muttered to himself, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Just a coincidence. But the vehicles weren't heading for another runway. They were heading directly toward Flight 419. The massive Boeing 777 lurched to a final definitive halt at Gate 47 of Terminal 3. The engines began their slow wind down, the high-pitched whine gradually fading until there was nothing left but an eerie, suffocating silence in the first-class cabin. The customary ding of the seatbelt sign turning off echoed through the plane, usually the signal for passengers to instantly jump up and clog the aisles in a chaotic race to deplane. This time, nobody moved. Everyone sat frozen, sensing that something was very wrong. Instead of the usual announcement about arrival time and gate information, the intercom crackled to life. Captain Reynolds' voice came through the speakers, completely devoid of his usual cheerful, welcoming cadence. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow. We have reached the gate. However, I am asking all passengers to remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have a security situation that requires the attention of local authorities before anyone can disembark. We ask for your patience and cooperation during this brief delay." A low murmur of anxiety rippled through the rows behind first class. Passengers began whispering to each other, pulling out phones to text family members about the delay. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. His hands were trembling now, though he tried to hide it by gripping his armrests. He looked at Jasmine one more time. She was calmly shutting down her ruined laptop, wiping the screen with a dry tissue with careful, methodical movements. She slid it into her leather tote along with her tablet and closed the bag with a quiet snap. She didn't look anxious or nervous or afraid. She looked like a woman who was precisely on schedule, following a plan that was unfolding exactly as she had designed it. "This is ridiculous." Richard barked, his voice higher than usual and laced with an undeniable threat of panic that he couldn't quite suppress. He turned toward the air marshal, who was standing guard near the galley entrance. "I am a managing director at Pinnacle Capital. I have a highly sensitive corporate acquisition meeting in less than 4 hours. You cannot hold me hostage on this plane because of some bureaucratic nonsense." The air marshal didn't even blink. His expression remained completely neutral, but his hand stayed near his hip. "Remain seated, Mr. Blackwell." The distinct sound of the heavy, reinforced cabin door unsealing echoed through the front galley with a pneumatic hiss. The mechanical horror of the jet bridge connecting to the fuselage groaned and creaked. Then came the heavy, deliberate thud of boots stepping onto the aircraft, multiple sets moving in formation. Richard expected to see airport security officers in their standard high-visibility yellow vests, maybe with a supervisor to ask a few questions about the incident and let him go with a warning. Instead, 4 officers from the Metropolitan Police stepped through the bulkhead doorway. They were armed with sidearms clearly visible on their tactical belts. Their faces were stern and professional, and they wore the distinctive black uniforms of the Aviation Security Operational Command Unit, the specialized division that handled serious crimes on aircraft. The lead officer was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped beard and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's worst behavior. He conferred quietly with Michael Torres, speaking in hushed tones, while Michael nodded and pointed directly at row 2. The officers bypassed the first row of pods entirely. They walked straight past the elderly couple in 1A and 1B who watched with wide eyes. They stopped directly beside seat 2B, forming a semicircle around Richard's pod. Richard Blackwell, the lead officer, asked, his thick London accent cutting through the dead air of the cabin like a knife through silk. Richard felt the blood drain from his face, actually felt it pooling heavily in his stomach and leaving his head light and dizzy. His carefully constructed, arrogant facade finally shattered completely, leaving behind a terrified, hungover man who suddenly understood that this was not going away. "Yes," Richard squeaked, then cleared his throat aggressively to try to lower his voice to something that sounded more masculine and confident. "Yes, I am Richard Blackwell. What is this about?" He tried to smile, to project the charm and authority that usually got him out of difficult situations. "If this is about the minor disagreement I had with this passenger, I can assure you it was a complete misunderstanding. Heat of the moment, you understand. I'm willing to pay for her dry cleaning and compensate her for any inconvenience. We can settle this right now between reasonable people." "Mr. Blackwell," the officer stated loudly and clearly, reading from a small notepad he pulled from his tactical vest. "You are being detained under the Aviation Security Act of 1982 for disruptive behavior intoxication on an aircraft and the physical assault of a fellow passenger." He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, the metal catching the cabin lights. "Please stand up, sir. Keep your hands visible at all times. Assault." Richard yelled, his panic exploding into desperate, frantic anger. He pointed a shaking finger at Jasmine, his face contorted with rage and fear. I dropped a plastic cup. "She's the one who threatened me. She told me there would be consequences. Ask the crew. Ask anyone here. You can't arrest me based on the word of some." He stopped himself at the very last second, realizing with a jolt of fear how close he had come to letting his naked prejudice slip out in front of armed police officers and a cabin full of witnesses recording on their phones. "Stand up, sir." Now, the second officer warned, his voice hard as granite. He took a step forward, his hand moving to rest on the bright yellow taser attached to his belt. "Or we will physically remove you from the seat. Your choice." Richard slowly stood up on legs that felt like water, his knees trembling visibly. His expensive suit looked rumpled and sad in the harsh cabin lighting. The entire first-class cabin was watching in absolute silence. From the corner of his eye, Richard could see Oliver Hutchinson across the aisle, openly recording the scene on his smartphone, the red recording light visible even from several feet away. The humiliation was absolute and total, burning through him like acid poured directly onto his soul. "Do you have any idea who I work for?" Richard tried one final desperate tactic, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to project authority and importance. The lead officer firmly grabbed his wrists and pulled them behind his back with professional efficiency. The cold steel of the handcuffs ratcheted tight with a series of metallic clicks biting into his skin hard enough to hurt. "I am a senior director at Pinnacle Capital." Richard continued, his voice rising to a near shout. "My firm spends millions with this airline every single year. David Patterson is a personal friend of mine. When I make one phone call to him, your superiors are going to have your badges for this outrageous treatment." "Actually, Mr. Blackwell?" The calm, smooth voice cut through Richard's rant like a hot knife through butter. Everyone froze. The officers paused mid-motion and turned. Every passenger's head swiveled. The entire cabin's attention focused like a laser beam on Jasmine Carter. She had finally stood up, rising from her seat with fluid grace. She smoothed the front of her dark trousers with one hand, completely ignoring the massive bourbon stain on her sweater. She slung her leather tote over her shoulder and stepped out of her pod into the aisle. She stood tall, taller than Richard had realized when she was seated, radiating an aura of absolute, untouchable authority that seemed to fill the entire space around her. The police officers instinctively stepped back slightly to give her room, recognizing the body language of someone who commanded respect without demanding it. "You won't be making any phone calls to David Patterson," Jasmine said, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent cabin. Her words were conversational in tone, but lethal in impact, each syllable precisely delivered. Richard stared at her, his brain struggling to process what was happening. The alcohol was still clouding his thoughts, making everything feel surreal and disconnected. How do you know, David?" He stammered, his voice cracking. Jasmine stepped closer to him, moving down the aisle with deliberate slowness. She looked directly into his wide, terrified eyes with an expression that was part pity and part cold satisfaction. "Because David Patterson was eagerly awaiting my signature on a highly lucrative exclusive corporate travel contract between Pinnacle Capital and Skybridge Airlines." Jasmine explained, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. Her words were perfectly enunciated, impossible to misunderstand. A contract worth approximately £40 million over 3 years that would have guaranteed your firm priority access to our entire global fleet. She paused, letting that number sink in. "A contract that I have just formally terminated." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. No sound came out. The £400 million deal. The partnership he'd been promised. His entire career trajectory. You see, Richard, Jasmine continued stepping even closer until she was less than 3 feet away from him. "You spent this entire flight making assumptions about who I am and why I was sitting next to you in that seat. You assumed I was beneath you in every way that mattered to your narrow worldview. You assumed you owned the space, the crew, the rules of engagement." She let the silence hang heavy in the air for a long moment. Even the police officers seemed transfixed by her words. "My name is Jasmine Carter," she said, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "I am the Vice President of Operations for Skybridge Airlines, the parent company of the very airline you are currently standing on. I oversee a fleet of 347 aircraft, 60,000 employees, and operational budgets that would make your portfolio management look like pocket change." Richard's face went from flushed red to ghostly pale in the span of 3 seconds. And, as of approximately 10 minutes ago, Jasmine continued. David Patterson was personally informed by our general counsel that you have been terminated from Pinnacle Capital effective immediately. Gross misconduct and breach of your firm's corporate morality clause. David was actually quite understanding about the situation. He expressed his profound apologies and assured us that Pinnacle Capital does not tolerate this behavior from anyone regardless of their position or their past performance. The cabin was so quiet that you could hear individual people breathing. You don't have a meeting at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Jasmine said her words falling like hammers. You don't have a job to go back to. You don't have a partnership waiting for you. And thanks to the permanent global flight ban I just placed on your passport profile in our database, a ban that 3 other major airline alliances have already agreed to honor, you don't even have a ride home. Richard Blackwell physically swayed on his feet, his legs giving out slightly beneath him. If the police officer hadn't been gripping his arm firmly, he would have collapsed onto the floor of the cabin like a puppet with cut strings. His face was ghostly pale now, his eyes wide with a horrified, soul-crushing realization that was almost painful to witness. He hadn't just insulted a random passenger. He hadn't just thrown a drink at someone who would file a complaint and move on with their life. He had assaulted the owner of the chessboard, and she had just swept every single one of his pieces off the board in one elegant move. Officers Jasmine turned to the Metropolitan Police, her tone shifting instantly back to professional grace and cooperation. Thank you for your extremely prompt response to this situation. Please remove him from my aircraft. Right this way, Mr. Blackwell, the lead officer said gruffly, giving Richard a firm shove forward toward the exit. As Richard was frog-marched down the aisle toward the door, his head hung low in complete defeat. His expensive suit looking suddenly cheap and pathetic in the harsh light, Oliver Hutchinson started a slow, deliberate clap. Within seconds, the rest of the first-class cabin joined in. The applause echoed off the curved walls of the fuselage, growing louder and more enthusiastic with each passing moment. Passengers in business class, hearing the commotion, began clapping too, without even knowing exactly what they were applauding. Jasmine did not look back at Richard. She didn't need the satisfaction of watching him being dragged away in handcuffs. She had already won in every way that mattered. She turned instead to Michael Torres, who was standing at attention near the galley, looking utterly awestruck by what he had just witnessed. Michael, please inform the rest of the passengers that they are free to disembark now. Jasmine instructed quietly, her voice warm and kind. With my personal apologies for the delay, and please tell Gabriella to meet me at the gate when she's finished with her duties. We need to discuss a promotion and some significant changes to our crew protection protocols. Yes, ma'am. Michael breathed, unable to keep the smile off his face. Right away. Jasmine Carter adjusted the strap of her leather tote bag on her shoulder, took one last look at the bourbon-stained seat where she'd spent 7 hours being systematically harassed, and walked toward the exit with her head held high. She was leaving the shattered ruins of Richard Blackwell's life, far behind her, 35,000 feet in the past where they belonged. Oliver Hutchinson's video was uploaded to X, formerly Twitter, before he even reached the baggage claim area. He posted it with a simple caption, entitled Executive Learns He Just Assaulted the VP of the Airline. Instant karma at 35,000 feet. Within 3 hours, the video had been viewed 8 million times and was trending globally in 17 countries. The footage was devastating in its clarity. It captured Richard's sneering face, his aggressive posture, the exact moment he screamed about diversity quotas, and the split second when he hurled the glass of bourbon directly at Jasmine's face. It captured her dignified silence in the aftermath, the bourbon dripping from her face while she sat perfectly still. And it captured every word of her calm, lethal reveal at the gate. News outlets picked up the story immediately. The Financial Times ran the headline, Pinnacle Director Arrested for In-Flight Assault of Skybridge Executive. Bloomberg published a scathing analysis titled How Entitlement and Prejudice Destroyed a Finance Career in 7 Hours. The Daily Mail, true to form, had already tracked down Richard's ex-wife's house in Connecticut, and was camped outside with cameras. Within 18 hours of landing, Pinnacle Capital had officially terminated Richard Blackwell. The corporate morality clause in his employment contract, the one his lawyer had assured him was just standard boilerplate, that would never be enforced, gave them legal cover to void his unvested stock options, forfeit his equity stake, and claw back a portion of his previous year's bonus. The £400 million takeover deal collapsed when the target firm caught wind of the viral video and cited reputational risk as grounds to terminate negotiations. The Crown Prosecution Service moved quickly. With video evidence, multiple witness statements, and testimony from the flight crew, Richard was convicted of assault and violating the Aviation Security Act. He narrowly avoided prison time due to his lack of prior criminal record, but received 400 hours of community service and fines that decimated what remained of his savings after the legal fees. The permanent flight ban was perhaps the cruelest consequence. Skybridge Airlines had placed his name and passport number in a shared database that 3 other major airline alliances agreed to honor within the week. Richard Blackwell would spend the rest of his life taking trains, buses, and ships to get anywhere beyond driving distance. 6 months after the incident, Richard was living in a small flat in Leeds, working a mid-level job at a regional insurance firm that paid a fraction of what he'd earned at Pinnacle. His former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him. His name had become a cautionary tale told in business schools and corporate ethics seminars. Meanwhile, 72 hours after Flight 419 landed, Jasmine Carter had convened an emergency meeting of Skybridge Airlines' board of directors. She didn't waste time on apologies or hand-wringing. She came prepared with a fully developed zero-tolerance policy for passenger abuse. The new protocol was elegant in its simplicity. Physical or verbal assault of crew members or passengers would result in immediate restraint by the air marshal, transfer to law enforcement upon landing, and permanent ban from all Skybridge aircraft worldwide. No warnings, no second chances, no exceptions based on elite status, ticket price, or corporate relationships. Gabriela Reyes was promoted to Global Director of In-Flight Safety and Staff Protection, a newly created executive position with real authority and a substantial budget. Her first initiative was designing a comprehensive training program for the airline's 60,000 flight attendants on de-escalation techniques, documentation protocols, and crew protection measures. Michael Torres became senior regional purser for the European division, overseeing a team of 300 cabin crew members and personally ensuring the new policies were implemented with consistency and compassion. Within 6 months, 3 other major carriers had adopted Skybridge's zero-tolerance framework. The International Air Transport Association recommended the policy as the global standard at their annual summit. Jasmine was invited to deliver the keynote address to 2,000 aviation professionals in Geneva. Her speech received a standing ovation that lasted 4 minutes. Her closing line became the new motto printed on every Skybridge boarding pass. Hospitality doesn't begin with the smile you give. It begins with the respect you assume. I've spent months researching stories like this one for the channel, and Jasmine Carter's response is the one that stays with me long after the video ends. Here's what strikes me most powerfully: she never raised her voice. Not once. While bourbon dripped from her face and ice cubes clattered around her feet, she sat there in perfect silence and typed 3 messages that systematically dismantled a man's entire world. That's what real power looks like in action. It doesn't scream or demand attention. It doesn't need to prove itself to anyone. It just executes with surgical precision and moves forward. Richard Blackwell spent that entire 7-hour flight measuring Jasmine by her appearance, her clothing the assumptions his prejudice whispered to him about who belongs in first class and who doesn't. He never once considered that the woman in the understated cashmere sweater sitting quietly beside him might be the exact person who decides whether his company keeps a £40 million contract. That's the lesson burned into this story. Your prejudice is a blindfold you strap onto your own face, and it will walk you straight off a cliff while you're still convinced you can see clearly. But here's the part that matters most to me personally. The reason I wanted to share this story with all of you, Jasmine, didn't just destroy one man's career and walk away satisfied with her personal revenge. She turned that moment of humiliation into genuine, lasting industry-wide reform. Gabriella and Michael got promoted into positions where they could protect others. 60,000 flight attendants received better training and real support. 3 other major airlines adopted the same zero-tolerance policies within months. One viral incident became a movement that changed how an entire industry thinks about respect and accountability. That's the fundamental difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is personal and temporary. It feels good for a moment and then fades. Justice is structural and permanent. It changes systems so that what happened to you can't happen to the next person. If you've ever been dismissed because of how you look, what someone assumed about your background, or because you didn't fit into their narrow mental box of who deserves respect, I hope Jasmine's story reminds you that your dignity is not up for negotiation. Ever. And the person underestimating you right now might be sitting next to the one person with the power to change everything. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone face consequences they absolutely earned? Share your story. And if you believe respect should be the baseline standard everywhere, regardless of status or ticket price, hit that subscribe button. We're bringing you more stories of accountability and justice every single week. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.